Hello everyone and welcome back to our spring term 2025 CEN seminar series. So we're kicking off with a very exciting topic today. We have Beverley Burke here, who is one of our developmental neurocognition lab members here at the CBCD. And she's going to be telling us about an introduction to visual discomfort. So just a little bit about Beverley. She obtained a degree in biology from Manchester University and her PhD in cellular and molecular biology, sounds complicated, at St George's University, London, during which time she held various academic research positions on topics including cancer, hypertension, neurodegeneration, and microbiology. She then took a career break from academia, but after a member of her family experienced visual discomfort, she began researching the subject area and applied to the Daphne Jackson Trust, who support people who've taken a break from their career in research, for a fellowship to study the topic at Birkbeck, which she's currently doing. So I will hand over to Beverley, who's going to tell us more about this very important topic.
Brilliant. Hello, everyone. So yeah, I'll be talking about visual discomfort. So you might know of or be more familiar with patterns of light in time, so flashes of light causing discomfort and conditions like photosensitive epilepsy. I'm not going to talk about the flashes of the flashing signal. Essentially, I'm going to talk about spatial signals, so patterns. So yeah. So I'll discuss how visual discomfort affects educators. So we can improve the reading rate of people that are experiencing visual discomfort using an intervention of coloured overlays. I'm going to talk about my N of 1 study and briefly talk about how overhead environmental lighting might be suboptimal for pupil and teachers' health and well-being. Why screening is needed for this visual discomfort, and specifically at key stage 1, because there's the environment changes from reading isolated words to reading pages and paragraphs of text, which is the visual stimuli that causes the aversion. There may be we know there is a critical period of visual development where the striate cortex has a steep development curve, and that might be the time to have the intervention. So I'll briefly talk about that. So how does visual discomfort affect educators? So text in susceptible individuals causes discomfort and or pain, which can lead to an aversion of reading. Intervention can improve the reading rate, and that intervention being coloured overlays or spectacles. So my N of 1 study. So in schools, we have a competitive environment, essentially, and week by week, N of 1 was never reaching the top of the list of top spellers in the class, would consistently get something like 3 out of 10 in her key stage 1 spelling tests. Realised she very much identified with the Winnie the Pooh, "My spelling is wobbly" poster, and she reported headaches on reading. She had an aversion to reading. She would be chased around the house to try to get her to do her practice, and had trouble getting her pen licence, which is in key stage 1, they were acknowledging acceptable writing, basically formation of words, and if you got that, you were able to write in pen. So in year 1, she had difficulty with her phonics screening, specifically with pseudo words. She was below the expected level on her SATs test. She was a reluctant reader, although she loved being read to. She had headaches on reading, and it was having a significant effect on well-being. And essentially, we were being told basically practice more. This eventually led to her actually having what I would say was potentially emotionally based school avoidance, and she left school and was educated at home for a very brief period. So family history and diagnosis. So there's an awareness of spelling difficulties and reading difficulties within her immediate family, and discomfort when looking at some regular structures such as fences, and an awareness of neurodivergence. Sort of wider members of the family might have diagnosis, and closer members of the family might have traits but not diagnosed. Her younger sibling was essentially 3 years younger, and when she had a greater spelling ability and was more competent at reading, was essentially lucky enough to be working in UCL brain science unit, and was advised to go and get an assessment for dyslexia, essentially. Wasn't the educational psychologist route didn't look like it was possible through the school, so we went through a private assessment at age 8, and the outcome was that the N of 1 had a specific learning difficulties of dyslexic nature, and the text was uncomfortable to view, and the colour reduces the discomfort, so she would reach for overlays. So this was the visual intervention that that was helping her, it was reducing this discomfort. They suggested a vision check. So when asked what was happening, so the perceived, she had distortions of the text. So essentially she said, it's like the letters are having a party and then it's like they've all gone to bed. The colour and alleviated the discomfort immediately. So N of 1's mother took to Google to see what was going on. The National Health Service have orthoptic clinics which screen for this condition, which is known as visual stress. They're experts in diagnosing eye movement problems and basically binocular vision. An increased reading rate at that point was of 5%, was indicative of visual stress, but it's since been updated to 15%. So before colour and after colour, if there's a 15% increase in reading rate, it's indicative of visual stress. They used a machine called colorimeter, but it was unclear what orthoptic clinics across the country had this and how to access this. So what next? It looked like the orthoptic route would have taken quite a lot of essentially waiting, and it became apparent that the same machine was available in high street opticians, some high street opticians, again, not available on the NHS. I later found out there's another route of behavioural optometry, which suggests eye exercises, and this is still, I don't know much more than that at this point. So what do susceptible individuals experience? So alternative visual perceptions, so distortions or misperceptions, they're called. So whether it's motion or shape, such as rivers in the text, or colour appearing in the text. They experience discomfort. This might be like glare from the page or eye strain and tiredness. And some can experience pain, which may be considered as an allodynia, which is defined as pain due to a stimulus that does not normally provoke pain by the International Association for the Study of Pain. Colour is a percept, and essentially by altering the perception of the page, the discomfort is reduced or disappears. So it's not a direct read of the environment. It's not a sensation colour. It's higher level input to colour perception. It's unclear whether visual stress is an isolated symptom, so whether the distortions in text are a single entity or whether they're part of a larger syndrome, and this kind of move from discomfort to pain, it's kind of unclear. There was definitely pain involved in N of 1's symptoms. So the high street opticians, so the colorimeter was designed by Professor Arnold Wilkins while he was at the University of Cambridge under the MRC Applied Psychology Unit. It varies the hue and saturation of light upon text, and you can change it and get the bespoke colour that feels most comfortable for the individual. You can then do this very specific Wilkins rate of reading test, which is 15 basic words that are repeated on 10 lines, and there's no semantic content, and essentially you are reading and assessed on how many words you get correct. You could quite often lines are skipped, which contributes to the overall score of your reading rate. The results and precision and reliability. So the Wilkinson's rate of reading test for the N of 1 without lenses was 36 words per minute. With her bespoke tinted lenses, it increased to 71 words per minute, which essentially was doubling almost the reading rate, which was a pretty quite a moment, let's put it that way. It was very obvious that it had reduced her symptoms. So a more than 15% improvement is likely to indicate improvements that exceed random variations. So she had quite a strong effect. She had no more headaches, and this is just a paper showing the reliability, the precision of the Wilkinson's rate of reading test. So and we took to Google again. So, the National Health Service UK will state that it's down to brain excitability, hyperexcitability. So and the overlays are believed to reduce the hyperexcitability within the visual cortex. To kind of understand that, we have to kind of zoom out a little bit into what visual discomfort is from a sort of broader perspective. So visual discomfort can be triggered not only by text, but also by stripes, and it's how the similarity between the stripes and the text that might be the key in that. So there's several different responses to stripes. You can get a very aversive response of having on EEG, effectively having a particular marker and an epileptic diagnosis on looking at these stripes. In the non-clinical population, a condition is called pattern glare, when people look at these stripes and they experience visual distortions such as colour, such as motion, or shapes appearing, so similar to what's experienced with the text. This was called visual discomfort back in 1984 by Wilkins. It also should be noted that people with migraine report more distortions when looking at these stripes. And colour also reduces the number of distortions when looking at stripes. So reading, I won't talk about reading epilepsy, but the reading epilepsy is also quite a rare condition, but in the non-clinical population, it's termed visual stress, or several other terms, which I should talk about later, one being Myers-Irvine syndrome. And that's when people experience the motion, essentially, when looking at text, and it is reduced when putting colour on top of the page. There is another pattern that has more high level semantic content called trypophobia, which is also part of my research, and it's when people report an aversion to clusters of holes, essentially, or circles, and this actually goes beyond sort of low-level visual properties and into an emotional response. People report the emotion of disgust or fear when looking at these. I'm sorry if anyone finds this aversive, because yeah, that's happened before, so I'll move on. So visual discomfort, may originate within the visual cortex. So within the visual cortex, we know that there are low-level visual neurons that respond to sort of low-level features of image. So things like orientation. So if a line is this way, there's a specific neuron in the visual cortex that responds to it. We know from the work of Hubel and Wiesel. And also spatial frequency, which refers to how often a scene changes, how often the luminance in the scene changes. It's also colour blobs within this visual cortex. And what we see here is ocular dominance columns. So, yeah. So it's been inferred from the work in epilepsy that there's an imbalance between the excitatory and the inhibitory neurons within the visual cortex, and it's this imbalance that's causing excitation, and that seems to be inferred by pharmacological intervention as well. And as there is an overlap between, so this is a Delphi study that was sent out to the opticians who primarily diagnosed this condition, and they asked what else is indicative of needing overlays, and essentially it was reporting motion specifically on looking at text, and also reporting more aversion to stripes. So there seems to be this overlap between aversion to stripes and aversion to text. Going a bit fast. So why would we experience visual discomfort overall? So we're saying specific images in our visual environment are reported to cause an aversive response in these susceptible individuals. And these images include regular geometric patterns, such as stripes, passages of text, and these clusters of circles. And the symptoms experienced by the viewer are varied, and they range from really clinically overt symptoms such as epilepsy and migraine to milder examples of discomfort and headaches, which would lead to reading difficulties and aversion in the playground, or feelings of disgust in school, and it's been hypothesised that it's because our visual system has developed to process the environment of our ancestor, our natural environment, and that these aversive reactions is down to a natural variation in the population's response to our current artificial environment, essentially. So we know that natural scenes have a reproducible characteristic based on spatial frequency and orientation and colour, and essentially by looking at artificial stripes and text, are we just stretching our visual system too far? And there's a paper coming out soon that's discussing how stripes and text, the stimuli, might be coded suboptimally. So the efficient coding hypothesis of visual discomfort. So this is in the non-clinical population, essentially looking at visual stimuli such as stripes and text that our visual system is not comfortable looking at, and the way we're coding that information is suboptimal. So our visual system is using too much energy to try to understand these visual stimuli. And this has been also inferred from looking at architecture, so where the bold response in the visual cortex is greater for visual scenes that are uncomfortable and diverge most greatly from natural scene statistics, cause a greater response in the visual cortex. And this is another important study that's looked at how coloured lenses reduce the cortical hyperactivation in the visual cortex. And this is specifically in people with migraine, and the reduction seems to be actually outside of the primary visual cortex. So there seems to be evidence that discomfort is related to excess energy being used on taking in uncomfortable images, and that this can be dampened by using precision coloured tinted lenses. So then the question was, well, who else has visual stress, and why is there no national screening? Cortical hyperexcitability sounds like quite a phenomenon that we want to try and monitor in our population. So then again, it's essentially down to, there's a bit of skepticism and controversy around the conditions. So the next part of this talk, I'll try to describe why I think there's controversy around the condition. So essentially, the irony of it is we're having difficulty using words to describe the difficulty in reading words. So we've known over 70 years ago is the first case I found that a child was able to read on yellow paper but not on white. Then there's a case of a dyslexic child who is unable to read words on white card but could read it on printed coloured card. And it was a teacher in New Zealand that first described this figure ground brightness contrast and reading difficulties in New Zealand. So that's Olive Mears. And then 40 years ago, a school psychologist in America called Helen Erlin gave a description of individuals who perceive text differently and whose perceptual distortions were alleviated with coloured filters. At the time, Helen Erlin and Olive Mears got together and listed the symptoms and described the condition, and they named it scotopic sensitivity syndrome. And that later caused some just confusion, essentially, because your scotopic vision is essentially at low light levels where your rods are most active, and when you're reading you need high acuity, and it's generally your cones. So it kind of started off on a confusing route. And then the perceptual processing disorder was named Erlin syndrome, and the Erlin Institute was formed in 1991, and coloured lenses were trademarked. But the diagnostic and the scientific background to how the colours were working wasn't backed up with much evidence initially. At the same time, Arnold Wilkins' description of visual discomfort, which was in Brain in 1984, looked at the aversion to stripes and the viewing conditions that would reduce the aversion, and the structure of the stripes that would increase the aversion. He then went on to develop the colorimeter, the machine that I mentioned earlier, in 92, and he carried out a double-masked randomised placebo control trial, and he demonstrated that sufferers do indeed need different colours, and the colours need to be defined with precision in some cases. He renamed the condition visual stress. And then in the 90s, there was a bit of an explosion that was essentially confusing the condition with dyslexia. So John Stein at the University of Oxford was working on 2 different colour lenses that reported to increase the or decrease visual symptoms in dyslexia, and this was in line with his magnocellular deficit hypothesis of dyslexia. So these parallel pathways in the optic tract that run from the retina to the primary visual cortex, the parvocellular pathway, the magnocellular and the kinetocellular pathway. And there is evidence to suggest that the magnocellular pathway is different in people that have dyslexia, and the initial visual theory of dyslexia came out in 1980, and the use of the coloured lenses in 1997 was introduced by Stein, whether it was just blue or yellow. But it seems that it's different colours that help different people, and it seems to be quite a wide range of colours. And actually in N-of-1's case, it was the colours between the purple and orange when using an overlay, but when using glasses, it was pink. So it also kind of adds to the controversy or the confusion perhaps, that you need a different colour, or you may need a different colour overlay than you would do glasses. But that makes complete sense to colour scientists, because with your glasses, you're changing the whole luminance of the room, whereas with an overlay, you're just changing the colour of essentially the object that you're looking at. Okay, then there was another introduction of these lenses by Harris, who is an optician who's actually looking at colour vision contact lenses, I believe, and had different colours on each eye, and found that actually in those individuals they also had an increase in their ability in their reading. So these filters were launched, these Harris Foundation filters. But by the by 2016, it became really apparent that visual stress shouldn't be confused with dyslexia, that they are different conditions, and the controversy that surrounds this visual stress is essentially down to untrialed methods and the fact that the reviews are partial. So it's actually generally accepted that colour does work and does improve the clarity of text. It's the reasons why it could be. So there are other conditions of the eyes, like accommodation difficulties, refractive error, and then there are also the kind of people choosing their favourite cover, or the placebo effect, or wanting to do better, knowing that you have this intervention in place. So yeah, it is hard. We need to get better at defining the people that actually have visual stress down to cortical hyperexcitability. We need to kind of filter out where the other places in the visual system where colour is helping. Yeah. And again, it was renamed sensory visual stress by Evans in 2022. But the nomenclature is currently being addressed by both Professor Evans and Wilkins to try and clarify the history and what people mean. They're talking about using different terms, essentially. So it's not that it doesn't work, it's that we do need more trials. But actually, in the meantime, people are using these intervention in practice. The overlays are available to buy. People can go into the opticians and get get the coloured glasses. You can request for exams to be on coloured paper, is my understanding. And there's whole publishers, Barrington Stoke, which address the format of text on a page to make it less aversive. So there are things happening. We're kind of taking it into our own hands in many ways. So my kind of contribution to this area, so visual discomfort on these low-level visual properties such as spatial frequency, how often the scene changes, and also colour contrast. These are examples of papers also by Professor Wilkins that show that when these low-level properties are significantly different from what we'd expect in natural scenes, we're reporting discomfort. This is another paper that is talking about orientation. So when the orientation of a scene isn't essentially isn't actually dominated. So when you look at a visual scene, as a natural scene, you tend to you're looking at horizontal information and vertical information and less oblique information. And this is relating unpleasantness of the viewing experience when you haven't got more dominant orientations within the scene you're looking at. So I've done a little bit of work looking at asking people to rate comfort of grating, so of stripes, and found just in the non-clinical population that people indeed do find particular spatial frequencies more uncomfortable, and particular orientations more uncomfortable, and that affects their level of comfort. I also looked at trait questionnaires. I haven't mentioned that there are several, actually there were quite a few questionnaires that are trying to identify this almost like a photosensitivity, and I compared 3 of them in the same individuals, in these 30 individuals, and found that they really correlate highly. So we are kind of drilling into the same construct, it seems. So I'm speeding through, but hopefully. So looking at, this bit is where I think we need to go next and at the moment. So looking at this state of visual discomfort. So this one moment in time when a susceptible individual is looking at the page of text. When should we be doing this? Or I would argue that we should be doing it at key stage 1, because there's this change in the environmental pressure. We are moving from books like Biff and Chip, where there are a few words on a page, to chapter books, essentially books that have stripes and you know, more visually stimulated. And there are several papers that look at how children's books get too cluttered, essentially too early. And again, this overlap between people who have this aversion for stripes and that have eye strain on reading has also been described. But actually at this age group, so this is Dr. Alex Shepherd, who is at Birkbeck, and she looked at Key Stage 1 to 4 to 7-year-olds and found that all but one child reported improvements in the clarity of text by using a coloured overlay, and most of them also improved their reading rate. There was no question of whether they felt pain or anything. But there's also reports in other conditions. So colour filters have been reported to be beneficial for children with dyslexia, children with autism, children with ADHD. So I don't think it classifies into one particular condition. I think this is part of our visual system not feeling comfortable, and perhaps certain populations respond differently to, or certain individuals respond differently to that aversion. And yeah, so we know that there is a critical period of visual system development. So when it's probably most commonly known as this lazy eye, there's a period up until the age of about 7 where if you have one eye that doesn't work as well as the other, you really need to correct it before, because these ocular dominant columns that we briefly touched on in the visual cortex won't develop properly unless you correct the input at the level of the eye. So we know that from some quite horrendous experiments on macaque and cats, but also from work when children have cataracts and have that one of their eyes doesn't have the input into the brain. So if that occurs for these binocular areas of the brain, then it kind of makes sense that it might be a critical period for how we develop our orientation columns and our spatial frequency neurons in the back of our in the primary visual cortex. So this is potentially a really important period to be looking at. However, it isn't that simple, and we should be considering our lighting environment as well as our immediate sort of 40 centimetres away environment. And we need to be aware, this is a paper also by Wilkins, it's just been in the Times Educational Supplement magazine, that's highlighting the fact, and this video won't work, but essentially there are a lot of LED lights in schools that flicker, and flicker affects reading rate and will also affect if a child goes to an optometrist and gets a coloured lens that works or uses an overlay. However, it will change if they're in a flickering light, and the effect won't be as strong as it would be if we were more aware of this lighting. So yeah, this is quite a recent, and it's really interesting that there's actually quite an easy way to test the lighting in your environment. So if you go onto your phone and find the video settings, there's a setting called super slow-mo, and if you put it on super slow-mo and hold it up to the light, you'll see flickering lights. If they're there, it's quite enlightening. Okay, so yeah, if we're going to look at the state of visual discomfort, these susceptible individuals with these specific paragraphs of text, we need to consider their environmental lighting more. So where will I go? Where do I think to go with future work? There isn't a kind of a field as such at the moment to enter into, but I think we also need to consider what's happening at the point of the retina, because we know that there's a lot of diversity in the colours that people can see based on the photoreceptors and the neurons essentially in the retina. We know that there is you know, that is, some of it is you're born with those pigments, or some people lacking pigments or even extra pigments, but we also know that over time this is affected as we age, so there is lots of variation at this point that we also need to consider. So I'm hoping, and I'm following the work of Professor Anna Franklin, who is coming to your ENCORE conference and to present her work, who's looking at this diversity in colour vision and how it affects people's ability to be educated, essentially. That she's found that she's audited Key Stage 1 and 2 textbooks and found that 7% put people who have this divergence of colour perception at a disadvantage. She would be presenting that at the conference. And then the back of work also of Gabby Jordan in Newcastle University, who is simulating colour vision divergence and colour, what was called colour blindness in children, and asking them, reporting high levels of frustration when they try to access the literature, educational literature. So yeah, so in summary, visual stress gives we assume it gives an educational disadvantage due to the student's environmental interaction, and this is when susceptible individuals are reading passages of text and it's resulting in a lower reading rate. There's intervention there to reduce visual stress, and it's available in the form of coloured overlays or lenses, which will allow us to use existing resources, or we could reformat the resources we have. So if it's a page that you need to print out, you could print it out in a colour that's less aversive, or we could change, like the Barrington Stoke publishers changed the repetitiveness of the paragraphs, etc. So we could reformat resources. We need to consider the role of environmental interactions like overhead lighting on the effect of this intervention and on student and teachers' well-being. And we need to reduce the controversy around the condition and really pull apart the terminology that's used, the misunderstanding, and that's currently happening with a multidisciplinary group which involves psychologists, architect, designers, opticians, mathematicians, biologists, all trying to work on how to communicate what we know about this condition, so we actually reach the impact that it should rightly have. I believe it's Key Stage 1 that's going to be the important, before individuals might learn to cope with it through other mechanisms, and the colour vision screening in schools is super important. And this is just massive thanks to Gillian Forrester, that was my first person I spoke to about this idea of coming back, and she's part of the Daphne Jackson Trust, who's supported my return to work to look at this, and Dr. Alex Shepherd, who looks at migraine, Professor Matt Longo, who's my supervisor, who is the orientation, who's really helped me with the orientation work, and I'm now working with Professor Wilkins as well, and thanks to Daphne Jackson Trust, Birkbeck and the MRC, and thank you for listening. Thanks.
Wow, a huge round of applause, because goodness me, that talk, you gave such a concise but broad and really in-depth cover, just summary of everything of this whole thing. That's more than unexpected. Extremely. And there was a nice plug in there for the ENCORE conference. Well done. Well done. Yeah, so everybody who's got questions, please pop them in the chat. I can see Michael's popped his camera on, so he probably has got something to say, but I did have sort of a big general sort of question which we mentioned beforehand, which I'll start with. So visual overlays, yeah. I remember when they were big fans, like you said, they became a massive thing. And then they started to be considered, almost a bit of a neuromyth, because the evidence didn't really seem to be there, or, the effects were sort of inconsistent, which now, having listened to your talk, I think, it might be because they were sort of using them generically. So they were just sort of giving them out to everyone, and not necessarily for visual stress specifically. So it might be that it was appearing to be inconsistent, possibly. But, I've interviewed many parents at this point who, they've reported that their children really benefit from the overlays and it really improves their reading. So I guess touching on what you mentioned about methods and trials and such, what do you think are some of the sort of the big challenges here with establishing this evidence base? And, is this issue of like identifying people a big part of it, maybe?
Yeah, I think pulling apart the other conditions that can be addressed using colour, so like accommodation difficulties, I think is really important. But I think the Delphi study that found the overlap between the reporting of aversion to stripes as well would be a way to actually kind of drill down to the people that are experiencing potentially their hyperexcitability and are probably most beneficial for using these overlays. And again, also this translation between the environment, considering the whole environment, the lighting in these studies and reporting that, I think is really important.
Yeah, so identification is really important, basically, Michael, I can see you've got your camera on. I don't know if you've got a question to ask.
Hi, Beverley, great talk.
Really we can't hear you. I don't know why we can't hear. Oh, it might be because neither of us have got our speakers on. Do you want to stick your speakers on, Beverley?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very good.
Oh, there we go.
Talk. I just want to ask about naturalistic environments and the difference between artificial and naturalistic environments in the context of outdoor classrooms, forest schools, those kind of things, about whether there's anything that the kind of visual stimuli associated with naturalistic environments are what kind of naturally less stressful to the visual system.
So I don't know of any off the top of my head. I kind of, the thing with natural environments and fractals that are also naturalistic is that they're what's called scale invariant. So they're kind of, the scale of them doesn't alter depending, or that the features of them doesn't alter depending on the scale. So there's that kind of understanding of well-being and how fractals might are perhaps rated as more beautiful. I'm kind of pulling in very vague information along those lines, but I can't think of anything more on that.
There we go. So we still haven't got questions in the chat. Michael, I don't know if you've got a follow-up. I have a few questions in addition. So if no one has any questions at the minute, I think I'll just carry on with mine. So another big question that came to me, I think the first time I sort of heard an iteration of this talk was, is there any sort of overlap with colour blindness? I think you touched on that a little bit with the colour rods and such, but
yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that's something we definitely need to look at. There was people with migraine had a kind of a different colour preference than people who didn't have migraine. And the work from Dr. Shepherd, she's found differences in the blue colour pathway in people with migraine. So it might be that actually at the sampling device of the retina, there might be differences that we need to be considering. And that's kind of Anna Franklin's area of research. I think it's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, touching on migraine, as a migraine sufferer, I have that interest in this. Me personally, I have trouble with sort of all the flashing strobe these line patterns and such, and I know many others also do. And I guess I was wondering a little bit more if you could talk about that, maybe an underlying mechanism that is uniting these different conditions. Is there sort of theory about that?
So with my, so I'm just thinking of there's a phantom array. Have you heard of the phantom array that people experience?
Oh, yes,
the
yes,
flickering. Yeah. So I can't pull my thoughts together with the migraine literature. I think the problem perhaps with why this hasn't been recognised as it should is the sheer breadth of the literature that you've got to understand, because it's spanning, you know, starting at epilepsy, dipping into migraine, and then in the non-clinical population, and then you're talking about colour, which is a massive. So I wouldn't know how to answer that at the moment, but I think there's definitely more and that study that showed that it was the extra striate areas that were being dampened by the use of colour in people that had pattern sensitive migraine is quite interesting. But yeah, like there was also the flicker as well, which is
that is interesting. My sort of follow on from that is, you know, is there any evidence that migraine sufferers kind of benefit from the use of these overlays, or?
Like stripe. So in the stripe based discomfort is reduced using if the stripes are coloured, and overlays are I don't know if it's overlays or precision lenses in that study would have an improvement on their hyperexcitability. And I cannot think of anything else.
Lenses would be better, because I think one of the issues with migraine, it's a predictable stimuli, isn't it?
Yes.
It just suddenly hits you and then you've got flare up.
And whether it's kind of accumulating rather than an immediate response like you get in epilepsy.
That's true. Thank you. So I have got there's no questions in the chat, so I will sort of big question that sort of came to me, and it's this issue of practice more. Because again, the interesting thing there is that, you know, the sort of consensus is in English reading, you need to do a lot of it to get good at it. So I can understand why teachers are saying do more and keep practicing. But then doing more of something that's hurting you is obviously quite damaging. So I guess in light of this whole field and your extensive studies on it, do you think that this approach of just do more reading needs to be kind of reframed in light of this?
Yeah, definitely. Just asking the question. The funny thing is, in the literature they found, and one, my daughter didn't realize the text was moving until she saw it not moving. So it's that kind of, you need to ask the questions, and you need to then change the state and report that difference to be able to really find out how common it is. Essentially, we're not asking that question, we're just assuming that. And eye testing has changed massively at schools and is massively different depending on where you live in the country, and that's just basic kind of acuity testing, which we know that, you know, that's suboptimal. So, you know, going to this next stage to asking for these extra tests, there needs to be more overall on kids' vision in schools, and their perception of the visual input, I think is really important.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. That's all the pressing questions that I had, and I can't see any in the chat. So unless we have any final last minute questions, I think we will say great big thank you again to Beverley for that such fascinating and broad and in-depth information for us. I think you've really enlightened everybody here on this kind of slightly confusing topic, as we've learned. So thank you so much, everybody, again, for coming back to our first CN seminar of the new term. So next week we also have another very interesting talk. We have Gavin Buckingham, and he's going to be telling us about co-creating research with dyspraxic children. So again, I think that will be a very interesting one. So hopefully see you all back here next week. Bye, everybody. Have a great week.